today at the entrance to the old St Andrews dock. The Boston office is behind me, and I've got Neil Parks here with me today, former chairman of the Boston Deep Sea Fishing and Ice Company. And Neil is going to do the introduction for us to the next video.
I'm delighted to have been given the opportunity to introduce Volume 8 of Distant Grounds, which is actually the second part of the history of my old company, the Boston Company. We're stood in front of our old offices on St Andrews Dock, one of the few buildings remaining of the old dock complex.
The Boston Company's first order for a factory freezer trawler went to Hall, Russell and Company of Aberdeen, a yard that was fast gaining a reputation as builders of stern trawlers. The vessel, named after the then chairman of the Boston Company, being Sir Fred Parks, registration number H385. She was named by Mrs. M. Snelling, daughter of Sir Basil Parks, granddaughter of Sir Fred Parks himself, and launched on the 9th of December 1965. After successfully completing her trials off the west coast of Scotland and under the command of skipper Bernard Wareham, on the 12th of March 1966 she sailed on a maiden voyage from Stornoway, direct to the Labrador and Newfoundland fishing grounds. The duration of her trip was 56 days, steaming an estimated 8,000 miles before returning to her home port of Hull to land 516 tons of frozen fish on the 7th of May 1966. To celebrate the pride of the Boston fleet, a reception was held for visiting dignitaries, and the vessel was put on public display. On the 22nd of May 1968 we nearly lost her altogether. The vessel was alongside in Hull Fish Dock, discharging her catch of 568 tons of fish, when a fire broke out in the officers' saloon. Spreading rapidly, the fire quickly engulfed the whole accommodation area. A man had become trapped in the chief engineer's cabin. The dockside crew were evacuated. Hull Fire Brigade were quick to arrive on the scene, and after cutting a hole in the side of the superstructure, the firemen were able to pull the man clear. The occasion was unique inasmuch as it was the first major fire where foam was used, costing then £200, but it was a mere price to pay for the saving of a man's life and a trawler worth £500,000. The Sir Fred Parks regularly landed between 500 and 600 tons after a trip. Her total landing for 1969 was 3,443 tons. It was the early 1960s that saw the introduction of the freezer trawler. The catching power of these new stern trawlers made them more cost effective than side trawlers, and trawler owners like the Boston Company were keen to invest heavily in stern trawlers from the mid-60s to the late 70s. The Boston Company built 5 freezer trawlers: the Sir Fred Parks, as we've seen, Lady Parks, Boston Lincoln, Boston York and Princess Anne. 4 distant water wet fish stern trawlers, which didn't freeze their catch, with the fish being packed in ice, were also built. These being the Boston Blenheim, Boston Sterling, Boston Halifax, Boston Beverly, all 130 to 140 feet in length. From the early 1970s, the Boston Company had invested some £6 million in new vessels just for Lowestoft alone. These were smaller wet fish stern trawlers, in the 80 to 110 foot range. There were 11 in all: Boston Sea King, Boston Sea Knight, Boston Sea Ranger, Boston Sea Vixen, Boston Sea Gazelle, Boston Sea Stallion, Boston Sea Harrier, Boston Sea Dart, Boston Sea Sprite, Boston Sea Fury, and finally Boston Sea Cobra. The company also had several new wet fish stern trawlers built for its Canadian subsidiary Arcadia Fisheries.
With half a pint and a roll your own. I know There is no living in the sea. Beneath an evening sky, a pile of kids side by side on an old settee. They swear like troopers and his beams for tea. I know the time goes quickly yet slow. There's a smile on every face. They haven't a clue about this great race, and they are saying endlessly, there is no living in the sea. Mark is in despair. She got 4 kids and greasy hair. She smokes
With the investment Boston's put into Canada, as well as the interest you had in France and Belgium, do you feel yourself that there wasn't anywhere else in the world for the company to operate?
Oh, there certainly were other places in the world. I mean, the Falkland Islands, South Atlantic, New Zealand, there were prolific grounds in these other places, but it required rather different vessels and a complete restructuring of marketing and everything else to venture into those parts of the world successfully.
More capital required than what the company was willing to put up, do you think?
Certainly more capital required than what we had available after sustaining all the losses of the late 1970s, early 80s.
I understand that the Boston Lincoln, one of your freezer trawlers, fished around the Falklands for hake, and quite readily have found she could have caught 200 to 300 tons of fish a day. And I also understand, on hearing this, the Falkland Islands and the Argentine government promptly declared a 100-mile or 200-mile fishing limit.
Yes, I think that's right. The Boston Lincoln, actually, that operation was took place before the Falklands War, and the Boston Lincoln was in fact operating under the Argentine flag, with Argentine observers on board, but a British crew, and largely operating in Argentinian waters as opposed to Falkland Island waters.
Would it? What size of vessel would it need to have been? Would you have needed to adopt the Russian system of the big factory trawlers and the motherships?
We had potentially set up with one of the larger British shipping companies an operation to catch fish in those waters, freeze it at sea, and then transship it into large reefers, almost certainly and then the reefers would transport the fish back to the European market.
But it was an opportunity that the company decided not to take up in view of the economic situation back here.
At that time, we had requested some research assistance and backing from the UK government, who had a fleet of fishing research vessels. And we needed a bit of the risk taking out of the situation, which could have been achieved by our own government doing some research in South Atlantic waters for us. They refused to do that for their own reasons, and I'm talking pre-Falklands War. And we, as a company, didn't think we could justify taking that risk on our own.
So basically, at the end of the day, the British government at the time then just sacrificed the old fishing industry, lock, stock and barrel, and was not willing to put up any financial help to help bail trawler owners out, or indeed help them find new fishing grounds.
That's right. It's an interesting scenario, isn't it? Because the big freezer trawlers were already being displaced from their traditional grounds in the North Atlantic. There were many potential fishing opportunities in the South Atlantic, but clearly, with the benefit of hindsight, the politics of the Falkland Islands versus Argentina in the 1970s prevented the government of the day from wanting to back any fishing activities in what were then international waters. If those activities had in fact got underway in the 1970s, one does just wonder whether the opportunity for the Argentinians to to invade South Georgia and Falklands would have been there. I think it would have been apparent to the government what was happening, or potentially what was happening much sooner.
The Boston Lincoln, GY 1399, seen here in William Wright Dye Dock in Hull in October 1969, being cut in two in order to have a further 27 foot 7 inches added to her length. She is being converted from a wet fish trawler to a freezer trawler. The work was carried out by St Andrews Engineering Company, Hull. A refrigeration and cold store plant were also installed. The alterations and refit were completed in March 1970 at a total cost of £150,000. In July 1971, Boston Lincoln was transferred from Grimsby to Hull, joining the company's other 3 freezer trawlers, thus allowing the freezer operation to be concentrated in just the one port.
Mark is in despair. She got 4 kids and greasy hair. She smokes more as the money gets tighter. Never gives in, she's a born fighter. I know the time goes quickly yet slow. She pulls a pint for the outer workers, turning down the road off as they make her. And they are saying endlessly, there is no living in the sea. And they are saying endlessly, there is no living in the sea.
The second new factory freezer trawler for the Boston Group also came from the same yard of Hall, Russell and Company, and was the Lady Parkes, identical to the Sir Fred Parkes. She was launched on the 22nd of February 1966 by Mrs. J. Ingle, granddaughter of Sir Fred Parkes. Appointed to command the new ship was skipper Peter Craven. He had been with the company since the mid-1960s, taking charge of his first ship as skipper in 1961, when he soon made a name as top man, and for a time was the youngest skipper sailing out of Hull. Sailing direct from Aberdeen on the 18th of May 1966, skipper Craven took the Lady Parkes on her maiden voyage to the northeast Canadian grounds. Fishing was very slack on the Labrador and Newfoundland grounds, and the new trawler was forced to steam an estimated 12,000 miles before completing her trip and returning home. Arriving for the first time at her home port of Hull on the 25th of July 1966, after a 68 days at sea, she landed 543 tons of cod and codling. The catch was also the first to be unloaded by an automatic conveyor system. She had the honour of being the top British freezer trawler in 1968, landing a total of 3,790 tons, and again in 1969 when she landed a record catch for the year of 4,169 tons from 7 trips and 288 days of sea, of which the skipper Peter Craven completed 6 trips and skipper Paddy Donahue completed 1. Sadly, 1977 saw her sold to her new owners for conversion to a research vessel working in the Antarctic.
Mist hangs heavy over the land, over the estuaries, shrouding the ships that move from the docks down the Humber to the sea. Bitter freezing the hail and the rain, when 3 fishing trawlers sailed out on the tide and never returned again. Off to the coast of Iceland they steer in the first month of the year, when the winter gales blow bitter and cold, and women must wait and fear. For no matter the storm, no matter the danger, the profits have got to be made. When owners give orders, the boats must go out, so they sail to a fisherman's grave. For 2 weeks and more, no signal was heard from the Santa Romana's crew. At length the owners ordered a search. By the end of a week they knew the Romanas was gone, the Peridot too, lost in the cold northern grounds, pulled down by the ice on the rigging and decks. 40 brave seamen were drowned. The owners refused to meet with the wives. They said they weren't to blame, till the news came in of a 3rd trawler loss. The Ross Cleveland was her name. The cold northern ice had captured and drowned her. The eaves of the old was
Another of the company freezer trawlers was the Boston York H3, constructed at her Gdynia shipyard in Poland, and was one of 4 trawlers of similar design and was specially strengthened against ice. Besides skipper George Downes, those accompanying her on her delivery trip from the Gidney yard were Mr Neil Parks and Mr J Bayram, who was the group's technical director. This trawler was later sold due to her small fish rooms only holding 400 tonnes capacity.
Moved from the docks down the Humber to the sea. Cold blow the waves on the graves of the seamen, warm blow the tears of their wives, but frozen the hearts of the men who have built their fortunes on fishermen's lives.
Decky, Decky, won't you marry me with your gutting knife, needle and twine? Oh, sweet maid, I cannot marry you, 'cause I've got no boots to put on. So off she went to her granddad's heavy gear and bought him a pair of the very, very best, and the Decky put them on. Decky, Decky, won't you marry me with your gutting knife, needle and twine? Oh, sweet maid, I cannot marry you, 'cause I've got no frock to put on. So off she went to Grandad's heavy gear and bought him a frock of the very, very best, and the Decky put it on. Oh, Decky, Decky, won't you marry me with your gutting knife, needle and twine? Oh, sweet maid, I cannot marry you, 'cause I've got no gloves to put on. So off she went to Grandad's heavy gear and bought him a pair of the very, very best, and the Decky put them on. Oh, Decky, Decky, won't you marry me with your gutting knife, needle and twine? Oh, sweet maid, I cannot marry you, 'cause I've got no sou'wester to put on. So off she went to Grandad's heavy gear and bought him a sou'wester of the very, very best, and the Decky put it on. Oh, Decky, Decky, won't you marry me with your gutting knife, needle and twine? Oh, sweet maid, I cannot marry you, 'cause I'm sailing on the early morning tide.
Here we have the Boston Beverly on the launching platform, about to be launched by my first cousin once removed, Miss Carol Wilbraham. Michael Dunstan, the chairman of Dunstan's, is in charge, and you see him there holding the bottle. The vessel enters the River Humber very smoothly, and she will be fitted out in the yard nearby. We're now on the river trials of the vessel, in the River Humber. She's now completed, and we're testing everything on her to make sure that she is 100% before she goes out on her maiden voyage. Seen here doing the measured mile again on the River Humber.
It's been said that British trawlers have been used for spying or intelligence gathering. Were any Pacific Boston vessels ever used in this way to your knowledge?
During the post-war period, obviously we had distant water trawlers fishing in some quite sensitive areas, in the White Sea, for example, north of Russia. Although I had no personal experience of this, I do know that one or two of our skippers were armed with simple cameras by the local naval liaison officer, and asked if they would photograph any activities which they may see in the course of their fishing trips which would or may be of interest to the Royal Navy.
Did any military personnel, to your knowledge, ever sail on any Boston vessels?
As far as I'm aware, never, but you've got to remember that I only came into the industry in the mid-1960s, and by that time technology was advancing quickly, and simple black and white cameras wouldn't be a great deal of help so far as those sort of activities were concerned.
How might something like that be set up? Who would approach the trawler owning company? How would it be set up if military personnel were to be carried on board a vessel?
Oh well, it was usually the local Royal Navy liaison officer who would come to see the trawler company to obtain their cooperation, and if that was forthcoming, they would then be invited to approach one or two suitable skippers.
What would have happened if the worst had come to the worst and a known British trawler was stopped and military personnel found on board? What do you think the outcome of that would have been?
Oh, undoubtedly the trawler would have been arrested and taken into a Russian port such as Murmansk. But to the best of my knowledge, those sort of personnel were not carried on trawlers. Here we see the Lloydsman on the stocks at the shipyard at Leith, just outside Edinburgh, ready for launch. At that time she was the largest ocean-going tug in the world, developing a huge horsepower, as you can see from that very large propeller. Most of my family were present for the launching ceremony, which was being carried out by Lady Mance, the wife of the then chairman of Lloyd's, Sir Henry Mance. You get some idea of the large size of this vessel from those shots. My wife and my brother there, Lady Mance, doing a good job breaking the champagne, and the vessel slips down the slipway smoothly into the Firth of Forth. Now we see my cousin Tony Wilbraham, who was then the managing director of United Towing, the owners of Lloydsman. My father, my mother, and some harbour tugs manoeuvring Lloydsman into position. A shot of the launching party, including the launching lady, Lady Mance. My brother Fred and my wife Susan and Fred's wife Judy, mother and father.
Yeah.
Now we see Boston Sterling about to be launched at the Crag shipyard at Goole. Boston Sterling was a medium-sized stern trawler capable of fishing grounds as far away as Iceland, but also capable of pelagic fishing for mackerel and herring, as well as demersal fishing. The launching lady, my dear wife Susan. The last blocks are knocked out. The champagne hits the bar stem and she slides gently into the River Ouse at Goole in the early morning. We move to her sister vessel, the Boston Halifax, which was launched by Lady Halifax. Again, a high spring tide in the early morning on the River Ouse. The Boston Halifax was to be based at Fleetwood, and she would be fishing at Iceland initially, as we still had a small time to run on the Icelandic agreement before limits were finally extended beyond 50 miles. The Halifax again slips quietly into the River Ouse.
The Boston Halifax cost in the region of £500,000 to build, and skipper Tom Smith, a distant water skipper, took her on a maiden voyage to Iceland. Later, with the British fleet banned from Icelandic waters, the company was forced to switch her to work the Norwegian coast, from where she returned in November 1978 to land 1,423 kits, grossing £45,868, the top vessel for that week. In extremely contrasting fortunes, an atmosphere of unrelieved gloom set the pattern for 1978. The European Economic Community had again failed to obtain any worthwhile agreements with other countries over fishing rights. Brussels had succeeded in decimating even the remnants of what remained of a once mighty distant water fishing fleet. It was a depressing sight as the year ended to see all the port's large deep-sea trawlers laid up without making one single trip in that year. Only 71 distant water trips were made in 1978, and those by a mere handful of freshers, mostly in the first 6 months. As winter approached in 1978, Boston Halifax was the port's only distant water vessel still working the northeast Arctic grounds, and she landed the last trip by a Grimsby distant water trawler on the 14th of December 1978. After 24 days, she returned from the Norwegian coast under skipper Ray Harris to put ashore only 778 10-stone kits, which made a mere £28,018. Only a few days after making that meagre landing, the Boston Halifax, last of the company's fleet to land in Grimsby, she slipped quietly out of port almost unnoticed to join the company's Lowestoft fleet. Tighter fishing restrictions contributed to crippling losses, which in turn created a withdrawal of the Boston Deep Sea Fisheries Grimsby vessels from the seas.
The Boston Sea King, on the stocks at Paul Shipyard near Hull, being prepared for launch, and the launching lady this time is Muriel Macpherson, an old family friend and wife of Dr. Macpherson from Bruff. The Boston Sea King is an 80-foot vessel, supposedly designed specially for the common fisheries policy and fishing in common market waters. Muriel Macpherson making a very good job of breaking the champagne on the Sea King's bows, and she slips gently into the River Humber. The first of a class of 3 of these 80-foot vessels to be based at Lowestoft. Again, these vessels, although designed to fish for demersal species primarily in the North Sea, were also capable of pelagic fishing for mackerel, and they were used for that purpose during the mid to late 1970s, when there were a lot of mackerel shoaling off Cornwall.
Boston Sea Dart, seen on the stocks, awaited her launch. Another of the company's new trawlers bound for the port of Lowestoft. And seen here in Lowestoft, itself awaiting the start of a first fishing trip. Sadly, this vessel was later converted to oil rig standby work. Boston Sea Ranger, LT328, seen here discharging her catch of mackerel to an awaiting lorry, along with a fleet of other trawlers that have been on the mackerel grounds. Built in 1976, Boston Sea Ranger was lost off southwest Cornwall in 1977 during the Cornish mackerel fishery. The mackerel fisheries were an important part of these trawlers' short working lives with the Boston Company, all later being sold off. These two Boston trawlers are unloading their catch to an Eastern Bloc factory trawler, which in turn would process the catch. Then the catch would mostly be sold to third world countries or go for fish meal. Eastern Bloc factory trawlers would remain on the Minch mackerel fishery and the Cornish mackerel fishery, buying all the mackerel they could process until the season came to an end. These two fisheries came at an important time, giving the northeast Arctic grounds a rest from the constant hammering from the freezer trawler, which switched to the mackerel fishery because of lack of quotas. Princess Anne H269 had the sad distinction of being the last new freezer trawler ordered by the Boston Company. She was fitted out for both demeral and pelagic fishing, her fish rooms being able to hold 800 tons of frozen fish. But really, it is sad to say that she arrived too late to take full advantage of the Arctic fishing grounds. She sailed on her maiden voyage in October 1974, and due to small quotas, spent a lot of time mackerel fishing. The Boston Company tried hard to keep her fishing all the year round. The small quotas proved far from economic, so much so that on the 13th of November 1981, under top skipper Peter Craven, she sailed for Bergen, Norway, to be converted into a survey ship.
At the end of the day, Neil, the British government left you with little opportunity and no chance at all of making a fishing company pay. So it was more or less down to the British government that you had to sell up and get out of the business, so to speak.
Yes, I mean, I had been present in Brussels throughout the period of the supposed renegotiation of the Common Fisheries Policy from 1979 to 1983, and it became very apparent to me that there was really going to be very little future, if any, for the English fishing industry as we had known it. There was going to be a limited future for the Scottish fishing industry. But we as a company were not really involved in Scotland, and it seemed to me that the right course of action was to get out if there was an opportunity.
So the Boston company, like the fishermen that worked for you, was just basically sacrificed and cast to one side then?
That's right. Well, the fishing opportunities were very limited by then. Many of our older trawlers had already been retired onto oil rig safety and standby duties, but that was a limited and competitive market, and trying to own and operate fishing vessels without the amount of quota and the availability of fishing grounds for them was a recipe for financial disaster.
Do you not find it a bitter pill to swallow that you, your father and your grandfather, at the end of the day, forced out of the fishing industry after a great investment over many years, and at the end of the day to have to sell vessels like the Lady Parks, the Sir Fred Parks, the Princess Anne, vessels which cost millions to build? You forced out the business with more or less no say in it.
That's right. Well, of course, my grandfather died in 1962, so he was out of the situation before it started to happen. But my father foresaw what was coming, and I always feel it was probably the main reason why he decided to retire to the Isle of Man in 1979. He couldn't bear watching the rapid decline of the fishing industry in Hull and the other major trawling ports, when he'd spent his working lifetime building it up.
A very sad day for the Boston company, Neil.
Yes, indeed, after so many years, that it should end in that way. I mean, I came into the industry as the decline was just about starting, and I suppose I was young enough and foolish enough to believe that there might still be a future, but I was mistaken.
Pipe Office Lane in West Street, Boston, Fred Parks' first home in the town, where he lived right up to his marriage. He then moved to Coronation Villa in Marsh Lane, Boston. Fred Parks helped to build this house as his passport to marriage. From there, now with a family of his own, they moved to a semi-detached house on London Road called Park Royd. Many years later, a Boston trawler was named after this house. From London Road, the family moved in 1912 to Vine Gardens Nurseries, where they had no running water, gas or electricity. The bathroom was a round tin bath in front of the kitchen fire, but the property had an adjoining 150-acre farm, of which 1 acre was under glass, a sizable amount for that period, and obviously invaluable during the war years. The family stayed here until the famous Lockwood incident, then moved to Lancashire. One of the homes they owned there was called Well Vale, on Warbeck Hill Road, North Shore, Blackpool. And they also owned Winmarleigh Hall, undoubtedly one of the Northwest's most imposing mansions. Could a young Fred Parks, who lived in a 2-up, 2-down in Pipe Office Lane in West Street, Boston, have ever envisaged he would end up with such wealth, becoming a fishing magnate and one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in the fishing world? Two other important concerns that the Parks family took over were the Hullgate Shipping Company Limited in 1962, then one of the largest coaster-owning concerns in the United Kingdom, and the United Towing Company Limited of Hull, then a large concern in itself. Together, father and son built up the largest privately owned trawler fleet in the world and extended their operations into many completely unexpected fields of enterprise. What a sad loss this proved to be for the town of Boston itself.
Well, this brings to an end the videos on Boston deep sea fisheries, which will represent for years to come an important historical record of one part of the British fishing industry in the 20th century.